So a short introduction, Janet already gave a very good one, but just for you to understand who you're chatting with today. So I've been in education for the past 10, 15 years, doing international jobs from London, but across Europe, Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and later on also Asia and Australia was one of my key markets. And then I decided to move to Australia. And for the past year and a half, more or less, I've been helping scale-ups with their go-to-market. Mainly thinking about which markets to go in next, but also the tactical side of things. What do you actually do to go into those markets? So I've worked for Relics, Pearson, a few Australian scale-ups like Learnosity, Prosper Education. And I'll go through this presentation on international market expansion using some of the examples I've worked with. I've anonymized them, obviously. But if you have any further questions, just shout. Happy to provide more detail. So what will we cover in this more or less hour? What I really want to do in quite a bit of detail is talk about assessment. How do you assess which markets do you go in next? Because it's quite labor intensive. It's quite challenging to move into a new country or new market. So assessing it and understanding which ones to choose is quite key before you start moving. Then the second thing that you then do when you've assessed which market you go to is identify your go-to-market strategy, your plan. That is something we will tackle next week. So I'll park that in this one. I won't go into detail there, but next week is all about go-to-market. And then I touch on a little bit about operations, partnerships, and legalities of moving into a new market. That's all part of the go-to-market, but go-to-market is really focused on the commercial end of it. How do you really make money in a new market? So I'll just touch on that lightly. I'll use an example of English language teaching, which a couple of my clients which I've worked with in Australia, scale-ups, are focused on ELT, but also my previous role within Pearson was focused on English language teaching. So I've got quite a bit of insight into that market. But because English language teaching goes across all segments, it starts with kindy all the way up to adult learning, it gives you quite a good feel for different segments. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And then a few highlights, really high level on the regions, Asia, America, the Americas, and EMEA. And then I'd like to finish with reasons not to enter a new market. And then obviously we've left questions till the end, but as we already said, if you have them during, please feel free to answer them or to post them. So my question to you first is, who already knows which market is your next market for your business?
Myself?
Yeah, just chuck it in the chat box if you have any ideas so far.
Indonesia, cool. Vietnam, Malaysia. Good. So all Asia focused. Good. Well, international schools, it can be. So Kim said international schools can definitely be a market if you're focused on English curriculum, for instance, or American curriculum. That goes through several markets, obviously, but you can tackle them quite centrally. So that's interesting, very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. So that is actually really the first question everyone needs to ask themselves. what is our long list, if you like, of countries that we are thinking about before you start your assessment. Because I had quite a few briefs in my lifetime of product management, go-to-market, is where either a client or a manager within Pearson or Relic says, oh, I want to expand. Please give me a plan. The world is quite large. So that kind of brief is difficult to start off with, and it's overwhelming, and you just can't boil the ocean. So it's really helpful, even if it's not based on any facts, but just gut feel, to start with a long list, if you like. And you can do that based on your experience with markets that do well in your segment, or you see competitors move into those markets and you think, hey, they're doing well, I could do that too. You can do it based on your resources, just because you know a few people that are great in a certain market, and you can employ them, or you can start a partnership with them. You can do it based on market entry, because you know it's easy to go into that market. Potential partnerships, that's very opportunistic. If you can get a good potential partnership in a country, that could really help you launch in that country. And then lastly, indeed, opportunism. It is all about opportunism in the end. Where can you find a way in? And that is really the starting point of your long list of countries to think about. Then once you have that long list, and that can sometimes be like 15 countries, or I had clients saying, okay, these 25 countries, can you please have a look at it? Then, yes, here it goes again. Then you start diving into the market drivers of those markets.
Just one thing before you move on, Vinne, to market drivers, just to the people who did answer that question, Indonesia, Malaysia, a couple of different countries there. Do you want to type into the box down the bottom, what were the things that sort of made you think about those markets? And maybe we'll revisit that at the end of this. Yeah, if you want to continue on, Vinne, and we'll have a chat after you've gone through the market drivers.
So once you have that large list, then you're going to look at the market drivers of those countries. So, and then focusing on your segment, obviously, and then what's the economic growth in that market? What's the economic condition in the first place? What's the importance of education in that specific market? Is it very high priority for state and parents, or is it less so? What are the policies? What's the government/private spend in that market? What's your specific segment growth? What you very often see is that in certain markets, you see that some segments are not growing at all and very difficult to get into, whereas other segments you can get into. So you can't look at a market and say, no, it's not growing at all. You really have to look at the different segments to understand whether there's potential for your specific product. As we're in education technology, the technological adoption is very, very important, especially in Asia, which are most of the markets that have been mentioned here. Teacher training is crucial because the technological adoption isn't really going that fast yet. People don't have the necessary infrastructures very often. They're not used to teaching. So it's not only about the student in this case. The students very often do know how to handle technology. It's more about the teacher in this case. They just not used to teaching with technology, and they're nervous about it. So thinking about that infrastructure of your teacher training and hand-holding the teachers is very, very important. And then obviously curriculum trends and any other market drivers that are relevant for your specific business. Could be number of teachers, for instance, available in a country. So that's really the second thing you think about. Okay, what are the key drivers of those long list markets you've chosen? So here are some examples from market drivers for the English language teaching market. So one of the very key one moving into digital is technology investment, not only from schools themselves, but also from the ministry. So what you see in quite a few markets, like for instance in the Middle East, but also in Peruvian markets like Peru, Colombia, etc. The ministry is heavily investing in technology infrastructure, which really helps when you're trying to pitch your solution to teachers, schools, principals, etc. Because they know they can already rely on help from state. So that's one of the key drivers for English language teaching, the ministry interventions. The other thing that is for English language teaching that is very important is that English language teaching, so it's mostly about teaching English for foreigners, so as a second language. And that happens, it does happen in K-12, so in the state sector, but the money really goes through the private language schools, so the PLS segment. And for that segment, it's very important for them because they compete against each other to have a competitive advantage. And that becomes more and more challenging the more PLSs you have in a market. So what you see there is that technology can be an advantage for them to stand out against their competition. So that's one other key driver in terms of technology investments. Then another key driver is the digital skills from teachers. They very often in many countries lack digital skills, so that's something to take into consideration, and it can really slow down the adoption of your solution. In this specific market, the eroding margins of private language schools is really a driver for them to start adopting technology because that's scalable and less costly. Then obviously the other side of the angle is the customers, the students or parents adopting the technology, where you see across almost all the segments in almost all the countries, you see a rapid adoption of mobiles and any other type of technology. So very often you see students and parents less so, but students adopting it really quickly, but schools lacking, and there's a gap between those. But schools will follow, so that's definitely a market driver. And then obviously mobile and cloud solutions. I saw some questions coming in. Are they? Janet, will you just?
Yeah, there's a couple of there's a couple of comments after the previous question that we asked, which was, why did you choose the markets that you're interested in? Nathan said that they just have, I think it seems like an opportunistic thing. They've just had some interest from universities there.
Yep.
Alex has identified that there's potential political positive trends, so upcoming free trade agreement with Indonesia, and like the physical proximity and demand from Indonesian students for Australian education. Kang's highlighted his background is from Vietnam, so he knows a bit about the space, and he's got a partner working over there as well. Hui says one of the products that they have has good traction in Malaysia, and they're looking at how they can expand other products into the same space. Yeah. And Kim has identified that they think they can align their content for any English-speaking schools, basically. So a couple of different ideas out there for early thoughts for different options for international markets.
Yeah, and those are great reasons to start looking at a market. And then if your market drivers really match your product market fit, it's really worthwhile to dive into, because these are typically reasons to start looking at. So just to finish off my example, so once you have your key growth markets for a particular market, you obviously, those key drivers need to benefit your proposition. So in this particular example, those growth drivers, because there's a drive to technology, there's a need for automation of learning, there's a need for pedagogy / teacher training, because teachers are lacking behind. There's also, because PLSs struggle with their ROI, and because there's so much competition, there tends to be a need in the market that's more about the business of learning rather than the teaching of English. So digital solutions to how to manage your school, how to make your school more efficient, those kind of things, really stem from those kind of growth drivers. And then the other thing that really, if you map it against all the market characteristics and drivers, what really shines through is that things need to be very, very basic, not too complex, just because of the segment in this case. And that is really different per segment. For instance, if you go into higher ed and you go into a medical space where I've been before I went into ELT, that's far more sophisticated. The budgets are more sophisticated. The solutions are much more data driven. So it really depends on what segment you are in and how far they are in their innovation curve. But for English language teaching, things need to be quite basic, because it's quite a big market too. So anyone can use it. So that's as of, I just wanted to give you an example as to what are key drivers then, and why do you need to look into those, and how do you map those key drivers to your business. Because what you very often see is that people talk about trends and talk about high level things happening in a market, and then you think, yeah, okay, nice, I see that happening. What does that mean for me or my business? So that's how we looked at it for English language teaching. Well, then now I've got so many screens on top of my screen that I can't see my slides anymore. Then after you've done your market drivers, you need to go into your market segmentation, which obviously you've got quite clear already, because you have a live product in Australia and that's thriving. So you know your market segment. Still, if you look at another country, that market segment is very often called differently. Student ages are different, grades are different, efficiency levels are rated differently. So that means that you need to re-segment your segment in a new market. And that really is almost every market you go into, you need to do that again. Apart from Kim's example, international schools. They are very, well, if it's a bridge curriculum, they just follow the A levels and the GCSE, and then you know exactly what age they go into what level and what the efficiency levels are for each grade. But other than that, if you want to map against a local curriculum, forget about it. Forget everything you've learned and just relook at it. So things that you need to take into consideration is student age, how rich are is your target audience, because that really depends on what share of wallet are you going to tap into, from a student, from a teacher, from a state, from a business owner. That really is something to analyze quite thoroughly. Parents' involvement, are they or are they not? And how are they or how are they not? Is it private? Is it public? What type of school is it? Is it religious or not? And teacher behavior, if your solution is interacting with a teacher, which very often happens in education technology, understanding their behavior, their fears, and how to help them overcome those, is really worthwhile in studying your segment and really laser focusing on your segment. Then, once you've done that, so you've got your long list, you know what drives those markets on your long list, you know what segment you are targeting in that long list, you start scoring. And you start rating all those markets based on the criteria that are relevant for your business. So these are, I've just summed up some things that I've seen come across markets quite a bit. So technology penetration, number of students, connectivity, state funding, curriculum, competition, whether there's government regulation or not, trade conditions, obviously, and very important, your product market fit. But there can be many more depending on what your product and offer and your proposition is. So here's an example that I've done for, and I've grayed most of it out just because I don't want to give away work that I've done for a client, obviously for reasons, for privacy reasons. But I just gave you a snapshot of what a scoring could look like. And I just highlighted one of the markets that we looked at, in this case, Brazil. And what we've done is we've looked at the market size. So we looked at how many, and this is for preschool. So how many kids are in preschool in this particular market, and how much money flows through that system. So what's the market size really? Then we looked at how many kids within the whole population go to preschool, because that gives you a very good feel in this particular case of how ready is this market for my solution, which is for preschool, and how much growth is still to come. For instance, in Brazil, more or less 50% goes to preschool. That means that when the population is getting richer and richer, probably that percentage goes up. So it's already quite a big chunk, 50%, but there's still room for growth there too. What age do they go to school? So they're in preschool till 6, and that differs hugely per country. Some go to school only when they're 8, some already when they're 4. And some also have numbers on how many preschools there are. In Brazil, you can't find that, which is also gives you a feel for, okay, this market probably isn't really well developed yet. Because, for instance, if you go to Malaysia, you've got all the numbers for preschool. They're just published, and you know exactly what type of preschool it is. And so it's very different per country. And the way I get those type of statistics is really based on a lot of desk research, but also talking to experts in those markets, understanding, okay, what are the drivers here? What are the key sources you use? Can you share those with us? Those kind of things. Then looking at the connectivity in Brazil, which is in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, is really good. But in most of the other states, it's horrendous. So it's a mixed bag, really. There's not a lot of budget, and there's no standardized curriculum for English, which makes it very tricky on the one side. But on the other side, it gives you as a vendor the possibility to introduce a curriculum. So that's also, if you look at the market, it's always looking at, is there already something existing that we need to map against, which is often a lot of work, but there is already penetration of that curriculum. So that's the upside of it. But the upside of not having a curriculum there yet is that you can start building that. And if you grow quick enough, people start adopting your curriculum. So there's an up and a downside to both scenarios. For this particular product, which is mobile heavy, mobile penetration was very important, whether it was high or not. Whether they had 21st century skills focused. In Brazil they don't, and what type of English they have. And in Brazil they're focused to American English. This particular product is British English, but that's also for ELT, that's a very important thing to take into consideration when you start scoring. And I'm no doubt there is something similar, like in this case English, for your business that you need to take into consideration in terms of criterion to start rating on. And then a few other criteria we looked at. So we looked at the competition and we said, okay, how many competitors are there? Is it a really full market, or do we have freedom to enter it and almost conquer the world, conquer the country? In Brazil, there's a lot of competition, but the quality is not fantastic. So that gives you room to still enter. There's not a lot of government regulations. There's no barrier in terms of competition. So sometimes a state already has an agreement with a particular competitor, and it's almost impossible as an outsider to get into it. In Brazil, that's not the case. In China, for instance, that's very often is the case. Whether there's a product market fit, in this case, product market fit was quite good, apart from the English. So it's British English and this is American English. There's not a lot of corporate governance in Brazil, which means that there's a lot of risk of bad ethics, which makes it sometimes difficult to do business in that type of country, and that is really something to take into consideration. And then a spin-off of this product was English and Chinese, and whether there's a need of learning Chinese in this country, and there's not. So these are things that we looked at for this particular business to start understanding, okay, what are the key markets that we need to dive into further? Because we've got this long list, then we start analyzing the long list, scoring it, and then we've got our short list, which we can start really going into detail and start creating go-to-market plans for. Let me stop just now and just ask if there are any questions.
Yep, don't forget you can put all your questions in the box down the bottom and then we'll just answer them as we go along. So if you want to continue on, Vinne, I'll just let you know if there's more questions.
Brilliant. Okay. Cool. So that's what, then you have your scoring matrix, and that actually every time I do that, it really feels like a revelation. Oh, I had this whole world I had to look into, and now I've got a short list of countries that I now, and it really starts to become very tangible at that point. And you think, okay, I might go into Brazil. Oh, I might go into Vietnam. And it really starts to feel like, okay, we're getting there now. We're getting to something tangible. And then you start analyzing those markets. And you do that a mix again with hard data, desk research, your experts that you have on the ground or that you found on the ground, and that's Very often when you start off with it, it's just friends of friends, basically. But they provide really good insights. But it's not only hard data. At this point, gut feel really starts to kick in too. And it's just because you start to get to know a country better, you get a feel for it, and you just start to feel, oh yeah, no, everything I hear, I'm not quite sure if my product can really, really break into this market because of X, Y, Z, or the other way around. Yeah, okay, the data says, well, the market isn't optimal, but the conversations I'm having and the potential partnerships I'm seeing give me a real upside. So that it's really important to allow the subjective view at this point too, that it's not only science at this point anymore, because well, in the end you need to do business in that new market, and that needs to feel good too, right? Otherwise you won't be. A question from me.
Yes, we do have a question, from Alex, which is, have you seen any key market segments that Australian higher education providers have typically performed well in? And the other question was, or any Australian EdTech companies in general that have, are there markets that receive Australian products particularly well?
Yeah, so for higher ed, America does really well. Yeah, great question indeed. Yeah, America does really well. The UK does really well. And what you very often see is it's almost reversed, that once you're in those markets, like the Middle East always looks at those markets. So then from those markets, you enter the Middle East quite easily, for instance. And when you're in America, you enter South America quite easily. So it's almost a snowball in that sense. But starting off with the US and the UK works really well. So for instance, Proctera, one of the very successful scale-ups in Australia, specifically focusing on higher ed, they do really well in the US, as an example.
And then is there a challenge there in terms of competition in those markets though?
Yeah, absolutely. And absolutely. So the US, it's a double-edged sword in that sense, because it's such an open market. It's really easy to enter, but you have a lot of competition. So you really need to do your homework in terms of what competition is out there and how do we stand out. Absolutely. You can't just launch another Me Too kind of product there. And the UK the same. Competition wise, it's fierce. Having said that though, both markets, their pricing is still really, really good. So even though you have lots of competition, it's not really price pressure you're feeling in comparison to large markets like India or Indonesia, for instance. Indonesia price is just very, very difficult. And the same for China. So there's an upside and a downside of it. None of the markets are easy, let me tell you that. None of them. But they all have other reasons why they are tricky. And yeah, for the US and the UK, do your homework in terms of competition. And if you crack it and you find the right partner to move into that market or the right model, you can be really, really successful. Then you had another question, Alex. Are there any particular market segments Australia EdTech companies do better than other markets? Well, you do quite well in assessment. So again, the English language assessment that I came from, Australia was the largest market in that. And that's very scalable. the downside of assessment is that it's, in general, it's not that scalable because every country has their own, own exams, obviously. So you always need to map against different curricula, different grade systems, etc. So that in terms of assessment, you're great, you can do it, but you need to know that every time you move into a new market, there's a cost involved and there's development time involved. You can just roll it out. So yeah, so and then I think, oh, I need to hurry up. I think in general, Australian education products are very high quality, and markets, Asian markets, look really up to them. It's finding that translation and how do you make sure that you understand that market, because quality wise you're ahead, as is the UK and the US, obviously, but they come from different angles. So if you find a gap in the market, and you find the good match between your product and that specific market, they trust you because you come from a high quality market. Just a question from me to you guys. Do you already have any dedicated resources in your team to focus on international expansion? Nope. So Nathan is saying no. Anyone else? One in Vietnam, mid 2020, very early stage. Yeah, so that's no. Yeah, so that's what I often see. And that's one piece of advice I really, really want to give you. If you're still penetrating Australia, don't think about another market yet if you don't have dedicated resources, because it will take your eye off the ball. And it's hard work. So really tackle one at a time, unless you get investments, and you can put a dedicated resource on it, because otherwise it's going to be very, very difficult, and you probably end up not doing anything really well. Then in terms of operations, so that's really the scoring and analyzing, assessing what markets to go into. Then the go-to-market we'll tackle next week. So we'll skip over that, the whole commercial thing and how do you make money, actually make money in a market. But then there's also the operational side of things that you need to think about. And we just talked about resources a little bit, people and budget. It's really important. You just can't do it on a shoestring. Moving into only flying there all the time, it is time consuming. You need people and you need brain power to do it. You don't spread yourself too thin. And the other thing you need to think about, and that is actually quite different for education to many other sectors, is thinking about, do you need people on the ground? Because if you have a B2B solution that sells from school to school, you do need people on the ground. You can't do that from Australia. You need to sell technology as such, not only your solution, but really sell the idea of technology in education, and you need to provide teacher training. And that's really something to keep in mind. And it's a bit different with the B2C solution, but even with the B2C solution, very often there's a B2B angle to it too, and then you need people on the ground. Then a very good way to launch into a market is with local partners. Some markets don't even allow you to go into the market without, like China. Vietnam, if you have to deal with the state, as you well know, you need to have a local partner because they deal with the state on behalf of you. So there's quite a few markets where the state just doesn't allow you. Yeah, state is tough. Yeah. It's really tough in Vietnam. So if you handle or if your proposition is really focused on states, then you need a partner very often. But even if you don't, just kicking open doors and those kind of things, it's really helpful if you work with a partner who's done that before. Going back to Brazil, for instance, Brazil is quite open. You can start up a business tomorrow if you'd like, but everything is relationship driven there. Everything. So if you don't know anyone, they won't, even if your solution is really good, they don't buy from you. They buy from their friends. So you need to have those friends working for you or working with you. So it's once you've assessed and once you understand, okay, these markets I'm going into, almost the first thing is, okay, what kind of, yeah, it's similar for Vietnam. Yeah, it's similar in very many countries, the relationship building. So almost if you've done your assessment and you know, okay, these are the markets, almost the first thing you do is looking for local partners and trying to understand, okay, how can we work together? And then lastly, something, and that's not my specialty, but it is something to think about, is legalities, the legal side of things, tax, because very often you go into something and you say, oh, I'm making loads of money, and then you need to pay everything to tax, and then you say, okay, I've made no money at all, and it's lots of work. So thinking about that, an example, for instance, if you deal in Argentina, you can't get your money out of Argentina. You need to buy cows or, well, their milk or anything like that to get your own money out of that country. Well, that is something to think about before moving into a country. So that's definitely something that's part of the first initial assessment before you even start moving. Well, we've talked about your priority region already, so we can skip that. Then, some highlights in terms of markets. First of all, curriculum is key. So we already talked about the international schools, so GCSE, A-level, AP, but you also have local curriculums like Matura in Poland, and every country, and sometimes even every state, like in Australia, has their own differentiations. So understanding that is really important. The age of the students is very important, number of years and how it compares to your Australian curriculum. When do they start their year? Is that in January or is it in September? Those kind of things are important to look at. Then another thing, once you've sussed that out, is price tolerance. And what I've always done with global products is create price bands. So I've done extensive research, understanding the price sensitivity of each country, what are they willing to pay for my product, and then I created price bands. And what you see, for instance, is there's a price band for the UK and the US, and Japan always falls into that. But then you have one that is completely different, and it can really be like the US, UK, you charge $25 per student per month, and then for India you price a dollar. So it's a massive difference. And India, Russia, Southeast Asia all fall into the same bucket. And Southeast Asia is a bit more nuanced. Some countries do for some products and some countries don't for other products. So you need to really look at that a bit more with nuance. But there's a massive price difference. And it is very important to really realize that that's the case before you move into a country and make a decision for a country. Because as we discussed earlier, the US is very competitive but very high priced. So you have lots of margin to play with there, whereas in India you just don't.
So Vinne, is a lot of this work that you do with price tolerance, does that come from, say, competitor analysis, or what kind of key areas would you want to look at when we talk about price?
So if you do it yourself, you don't have much budget and much many resources. Yeah, you look at competition, you speak to some stakeholders, some prospects, and you try to get a feel for it.
Kang's also asked a question, which is basically, is it a problem to offer different prices in different countries? Is that a common practice?
It's common practice, but you need to have a lot of governance around it. So technically you need to make sure that people can only buy within their country, and you need to make sure that if you deal with distributors, that they are briefed very well, that your agreements with them are just very tight. So there's a lot of thinking behind that. But definitely large multinationals all charge different prices in different countries. So going back to your question, Janet. So that's how you do it when you do it quick and dirty. If you really want to do it and you see traction, and you think, okay, because with price, you can actually, if you have the right price, it can make a massive difference for your business. So putting some effort behind that makes sense when you start to see you have traction. And there I always do primary research. So I always do two analysis, a conjoint analysis in combination with Van Westendorp analysis, and figuring out what people are willing to pay for what feature and how does that compare if you package things up. So it's and that takes a bit more time and effort because you need quite a lot of respondents to do that. Oh yeah, it's a conjoint analysis. Let me just, because my accent is, I apologize. And Van West. So, and those two you need to combine.
I think that's a whole other session that we're going to have to do for that.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but it's very important to think about it, and especially when picking a country. Then the third thing to think about is private state, which I think everyone is familiar with. Europe is very difficult from that perspective. Very difficult if you go into K-12. Less so for higher ed. So you need to think about it. US is almost all private, and UK and Australia is a good mix. So those are interesting countries for that reason. I touched on ethics a little earlier, a little bit. The way of doing business, state intervention, it's real. I mean, I've been in two businesses where our office was sold. It was our office, but the guy who was running it sold our office. So there are things to think about. And how do you make sure that you can manage that? And then barriers to entry. So curriculum is a massive barrier. Competition we already talked about, and state regulation. Because state regulation, for instance, in China, is a massive barrier of entry. Well, here's just a few highlights. So Asia in general, if you move into Asia, and loads of the countries that you've mentioned are Asian markets, you need to have a good teacher training proposition there, especially if it's B2B, because otherwise it will just not happen. China, you need a strong, trustworthy local partner, because otherwise it's just not going to fly. South Korea is very difficult to manage from a distance. And yeah, that has lots of reasons. There's a lot of competition. Education is very, very key, but it's quite corrupt. So it's difficult to do business there, and you just need people on the ground. Japan, fantastic market, but it takes ages to get there. So if you want a quick win, don't go to Japan. But once you're there, you're there. And Japan and Germany are very close. So almost everything that goes into Japan also goes into Germany. Not as much the other way around, but that's a good thing to take into consideration. Indonesia and India, lots of potential, difficult to operate, very low price, extremely low price. Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia are relatively easy to enter, especially from Australia. Then the Americas, USA, high competition, as we already discussed, and it's state by state, like Australia. And it's a massive country, so it's a big investment if you really want to go into the US. So it's almost like don't go into the US, but start with a state like Texas, for instance, is very technology savvy. Might be a good way to start, or California. Brazil, an example, is it's very, very relationship based. Sorry, I'm reading the question. Correct. Yeah, I should have put UK in there actually. Sorry, just missed that. Yeah, it's a decent size, highly competitive though, and you really need to understand the curriculum, and the state changes because the state makes quite a few changes quite often. But once you're in there, it's easy from Australia to enter the UK. Correct. Yeah. Europe, every country is different. Therefore, segments tend to be very small, but still they're big markets. But it's constantly, the language is different, the state regulation is different. So it's not, let's go into Europe. It's really go into France, go into Germany, go into etc. Middle East is funding-wise very, very interesting. They have loads of money funded centrally from sheikhs, etc. So that's worthwhile looking into, and it's all done by big bids. So if you have a great solution, they're very interested in innovation. So it's a good thing to look at. And then Africa, if you want to move into Africa, I always say, let's start with South Africa. It's easy, it's English. And from there it travels. But again, it's price-wise, it's quite difficult. Then last but not least, and I'll keep this really short, Janet, because I think I've got 4 more minutes. So reasons not to enter yet, I say. And this is almost a SWOT, like looking at your strengths and weaknesses and the opportunities and threats for each country. But internally, your organization, if your organization isn't ready, so you don't have the resources to focus on another market, just don't do it yet. Just wait, either before you get another funding round in, or before you get more revenue in so you can hire people, but don't try to do it on the side. If you don't have any expertise on the ground, it's going to be very difficult. And you have to look at your company structure. How does that, and especially if you go into like China, you need a local entity. So looking at that, if you don't want to do that now, just don't move into another country yet. Then you have got external stuff. If there's loads of competition in your specific field, maybe just don't move into it. If the barriers of entry are high, ethical issues we've discussed, low price tolerance, it's really something you might want to consider, just not moving into those markets just yet. Just make your margins and your money elsewhere and then move into there once you have scale. And geopolitical situations, like Venezuela, it's very difficult to do business now. Turkey is very difficult to do business now. And then we already discussed tax and legalities. So you need to start tomorrow, obviously, as we all do. When you start, think about your market prioritization first. Market drivers, market segmentation, scoring, analysis, and then define your go-to-market. Because what I very often see is that people start with their go-to-market. Oh, and we do a leaflet and we go to a conference and we do that. And you have a whole list of stuff you do, but you haven't really analyzed yet whether that's the market to go after or not. So those are my 2 cents.